Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devview.com. In this lesson, we want to start with the process of dissecting this tiny little application that we created. Previously, I wanted you to focus on the workflow, what we did, and how we did it. Now, I want to focus on why we did what we did. It's crucial that we cement these ideas in your mind because they really provide the basis, the foundation for everything else that comes next after this. So what I want to do is start on the inside and work our way out. And whenever you learn how to write applications with Visual Basic, learning the syntax of Visual Basic, or in other words, learning the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language is really just half of the battle. The other half of the battle is learning about related pre-built functionality that's available to the programming language. So in our case, Microsoft has created something called the .NET Framework. And while that sounds a little mysterious, it's actually not all that bad. For now, there's really just two parts of the .NET Framework that really concern us. First, there's a class library, which is simply a library of code that Microsoft wrote to take care of difficult tasks so that we as developers who will utilize or borrow from that library, we don't have to build that code ourselves. We can just rely or borrow that code from Microsoft. So there's this library of code to help with things like math operations or working with text or displaying things to the computer screen or transmitting information over the internet and a ton of other stuff. So that's the first part, the class library, which is part of the .NET Framework. The second part is called the .NET Framework Runtime. It's also known as the Common Language Runtime, or the CLR. So the CLR, the runtime, is just this protective bubble that your application, when it's running, lives inside of. And I use the term protective bubble because the CLR, the runtime, it takes care of all the low-level details so that you, the developer, can focus on what the application does and less about interacting with the computer's operating system, with its memory, with its hardware, and so on. And furthermore, the CLR, it provides this layer of protection to the end user so that you, the malicious, evil software developer, you can't really hurt the end user's computer, at least not without them asking permission if you can delete their whole hard drive, okay? So they'll have some knowledge or some ability to say, no, I don't want to delete the entire hard drive. So for right now, it's really the .NET Framework class library, the first thing we talked about, that I want to focus on because we're writing code. So whenever we typed in this phrase, console.writeLine, we were using some code in the class library that knows how to display text in a Windows command line window. And then all we have to do as the programmers is actually say what it is that we want displayed to the end user. And so we're just focusing on the important part. These are the words we want written out to the screen. Everything else, how is actually written out to screen? Well, that's the part that Microsoft takes care of for us because they wrote a library of code that we're able to borrow or use. So this next line of code is also important. Here we're telling our application to wait for input before continuing to execute. So here again, we're calling a method inside of the .NET Framework class library that expects input from the end user. Now, we don't have to actually go through the hard work of listening for keyboard strokes and worrying about the signal as it's passed through the operating system and worrying about the hardware of the keyboard. All of that is abstracted away from us. All we got to do is say, we want to wait for the user to actually do something on the keyboard before we continue on, okay? So, what happens if I were to actually say, let's ignore this line of code? And to do that, what I'm going to do is add a code comment. And I can use a single quote mark in Visual Basic as a way to comment out a line of code. This means that I want you the compiler, as you're running my application, to ignore this line of code. We're essentially deleting it, but we're leaving it in the source code. I could have just deleted this out completely. So I'm going to select it all with my keyboard by hitting the arrow keys. I use the arrow keys a lot. You'll want to use those, as well as the home and the end key, so I can jump to the beginning of the line and the end of the line for any line of code. And I can also use the arrow key to move back and forth inside of the code. So here I'm going to hit the home key and then hold down the shift key and then hit the end key to make a complete selection. And then I can hit Control X on my keyboard, just like I do in any Windows application, to actually delete that line of code. And yeah, I could have done that. However, now it's gone and I can't ever add it back in. I'd have to retype it. So commenting out the line of code is the preferred way to actually do an experiment without deleting your code completely, but you're saying ignore this line of code whenever you're actually running my application. Okay. So now what happens if we were to run the application, but we left out that console.read line? Let's go ahead and run the application by clicking the start button. And it executed in a fraction of a second and then it ended. All right. So without pausing the application, saying we need to wait for an end user to hit the enter key on the keyboard, the application executes and it's finished in a fraction of a second. All right, it flashed on screen and then went away. And so that's why we need both of these lines of code in order for our application to work the way that we had expected. Okay, so let's talk about the position of the code. You'll recall that I made sure in that previous video to emphasize that you have to put the code in the right place in order to get the same results that I got on my screen. So the right place was between this sub main statement and this end sub statement. All right, so together these define a block of code. And you can see when I even put my mouse cursor on this line that it will highlight the corresponding end sub. So here's the beginning sub and the end sub. Furthermore, I can hover my mouse cursor off to the left-hand side with this little minus, and notice that it will highlight in a very, very light gray color the entire section, saying that this all belongs together as one block of code. Furthermore, I can go ahead and click that little minus sign and it will roll the code up. And you'll notice that now we're going from line 1, 2, 3, and then we jump down to 10. Where did 4 through 9 go? They're actually rolled up together in this little section, and I can hover my mouse cursor over it and we can see the full definition for that sub main in a little window that pops up underneath our mouse cursor. But essentially what we're saying here is that this code all belongs together in a single code block, and this code block has a name. We've given it a name called main. And once it has a name, we can call it by its name. So before we get to that, let's talk about this other level of indentation that we have here, an outermost module. And as I hover my mouse cursor or put my mouse cursor on the module, notice that it corresponds here down at the bottom with this end module word. Okay, so you can think of when you write code as a series of containers. Here we have a container for our code, and then it sits inside of another container for our code. All right. So I'm going to oversimplify it for just a moment and build on this definition, but basically this innermost code block here is known as a subroutine, or basically just a sub. It's actually known by many names, and the context of how we're using it will determine what we call it. So in this case, just a sub or a subroutine. In other words, it's just a block of code that has a name and we can call it by its name. We'll come back to that in a moment. In other situations, we might see it called a function. All right. And notice when I change the word function here, it changed the word function down there. Now we do get a little squiggly line here because it's not really being used the way that it was intended to be used. We'll come back to that later. Let me go ahead and type the word sub here again and notice that it automatically changes it to end sub for me again. All right. And then in other situations, it's not known as a sub or a function, but rather just in general terms as a method. And so I'm actually going to use that term method many times whenever I'm referring to either a sub or a function. So we'll talk about what methods are. They have a very specific meaning, but for right now, I'm just going to use it in a very general sense. That this is a method, and the method has a name. The name of that code block is called main. Now, this specific subroutine, the specific method, it actually has a special purpose in our system. Since its name is main, it just so happens that this code will execute first whenever our application runs. So whenever the application comes to life, the application will look for an entry point. What do I do first? And whatever is defined inside of this method called main will be the first code that actually gets executed. From here, then we would actually call other subroutines or functions methods in order to accomplish things in our application. We'll see examples of that as we continue on in this course. So later on, you're going to come to realize that a method, in this case just a sub, a method means so much more, but I just want to use that simple working definition of it being a code block that has a name, and since it has a name, we can call it by its name in order to execute that block of code. So whenever you have a name, you can call something by its name, whether it be a method or a module or a class and so on. We'll talk about all these ideas a little bit later in more detail. So the main method lives inside of this module, a module simply known as module 1, the default name. All right. And so a module is simply a way to, simply an organizational tool. It's a way for us to keep all of the methods, the subroutines, the functions, that kind of are related together in some way, that are similar in nature. So you put all of the methods that are somehow related into a single module. There will be another container for your methods that we'll talk about later that's called a class. So a module is kind of like a class, but a class has a slightly more advanced and very important usage in Visual Basic. But in both cases, whether we're talking about modules or classes, you're going to put all the methods that are somehow related together inside of that same kind of organizational unit, that Tupperware container, as I sometimes call it, okay? So what do I mean by related together? Well, that's really up for you as the programmer to decide based on the type of application that you're building. You're going to come to understand as we go further through this and as you continue on past this course, the philosophies of writing code that will dictate where the code should reside inside of your application. So the module is pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward, and that's why we're starting with it here. And the class is a little bit more advanced, but ultimately they're kind of the same. In fact, a class actually is more than just an organizational tool. I really oversimplified it, like I oversimplified the notion of methods, but I want to keep it simple for now. Let's just use that as a working definition until we get a couple of lessons from now when we'll start creating classes of our own, and we'll talk about why classes are so important. But the main takeaway now is that code is organized inside of code blocks, and you define a code block by using a keyword like sub or function and then end sub or end function. Or another type called a module and end module. Eventually we'll create class, end class. Those define code blocks. And code blocks can live inside of other code blocks as an organizational unit. All right, so let's take a look at this line of code again here, line number 5, as you see on my screen. Here we're actually executing a method. We said before that this is from a library that Microsoft created, and that's true, but we're actually executing a specific method by using its name, WriteLine. And so now anything that was defined inside of the WriteLine method by somebody at Microsoft will get executed when we call the name of that method, okay? So it actually lives inside of a class, a container called console. And so this second line of code that we wrote also is from the console class, but it calls a different method called readline. So readline is calling a different block of code that somebody at Microsoft actually wrote. And we've already talked about the purpose of WriteLine versus readline. Why are they both associated with this console class? Well, they're organized into the same class, the console class, because they both have something to do with building applications that display as console windows on our computer. So they're related in a sense in that way. If I wanted to do something with the Windows console, what would I do? I'd go to the console class and then call one of its related methods, okay? And the way that I do that is by accessing the methods of class using this little dot operator, all right, the period on our keyboard. So here we're able to say essentially module1.main, except in our case we're saying console.writeLine or console.readLine. So this little period is actually known as a member accessor. In other words, we can access a member of the console class by using a period, and then after the period, the name of the class, the period, then we can look at all the members of that class, the members being the various methods and other things that were defined inside of the console class, all right? And then we can actually type the name of the member, in this case, the WriteLine member method versus the readLine member or method in order to execute it, all right? Now notice that immediately following both the WriteLine and the readLine, that in both cases we have a pair of parentheses. Now, admittedly, in this first case, we're actually putting something inside of the parentheses. In this second case, we're not putting anything inside of the parentheses. In the case of the readLine here in line number 6, really all we want to do is just say, go ahead and wait for input from the user. So we're using an opening and closing parentheses because we don't have any extra information to tell that library of code that Microsoft wrote. We're just saying wait. Here, however, we need to give some additional instructions. We need to say what we want WriteLine to print to the console window. So to do that, we're going to give it the words we want it to print to screen. And whenever we're going to give it words, we need to treat them as a literal string of individual characters. So I want you to write the letter H, the letter E, the letter L, the letter O, and so on, and use a space. So I want this exact string of individual characters. So we're going to call this a string, literally this string of characters, so a literal string of characters to the console window. And so we're going to talk about strings versus other types of information, maybe numbers, maybe true, false, maybe dates and times, all right? So we'll talk about data types in Visual Basic in another lesson, but it's pretty crucial to understanding Visual Basic. But here we're going to give it a literal string of characters we want printed out to screen. All right, but the key idea here is that some of these methods can accept input as parameters, so we'll call them input parameters, and some of them don't require any input parameters in order to do their jobs, all right? So we're going to come back to the notion of methods in the future and how to pass data into methods, just like we did here with Hello World in line number 5, and the significance of the double quotes. But just know that whenever you see a set of parentheses after a word, the method is being invoked. So the parentheses are actually a special tool inside of Visual Basic called a method invocation operator. We want to invoke the method. We want to say, do it, run, go, do your job. And here we'll provide you some extra information in the form of an input parameter, okay? So that's the purpose of the open and close parentheses. So Visual Basic is really lax about some things and is pretty strict about some other things. In some programming languages, you could stretch a single line of code onto multiple lines because the line of code is so long that it might run off the visible area here inside of your code window. And now, in some cases, like in C#, you can do that automatically. You don't have to do anything special. However, in Visual Basic, it's not the default behavior. If I were to try and separate this single line to two lines of code, the single instruction onto 2 lines, I'm going to get a bunch of errors, all right? In Visual Basic, by default, a single line represents a single idea, a single thought. It's like a sentence in the English language. And to separate these onto 2 separate lines, you're essentially creating 2 sentences without using the correct punctuation, all right, if that's the right analogy, okay. But you can actually do this if I had a really long line of code and I needed to separate it so I don't have to scroll off to the right-hand side of the screen every time that I wanted to read my code. I can use what's called a line continuation character in Visual Basic. So it's simply an underscore. So in this case, I'm able to say console, and then hang on a second, let me use an underscore, right line, okay. And I might use some indentation here just to make it obvious that these two kind of belong together, all right, but that's not necessary. So in this case, this would be kind of silly to actually do this, so I'm going to remove it, but you can use an underscore character, and we will throughout this course to split up lines onto multiple lines to make it more readable so that it doesn't go off to the right-hand side of the screen. Additionally, I can kind of do the opposite, where I can put multiple lines of multiple instructions on a single line. And so here again in Visual Basic, one line by default represents one instruction. And so we have two instructions in our program right now. But what if I wanted to combine them onto the same line of code? If I try to do that without anything, I would get some errors, right? Because there's really nothing separated, and you would see the end of the statement was expected. And so if I really wanted to do this, and there's really not much of a reason to, but you might see it in somebody else's code, you can use a colon. In that case, now we've ended one line of code here, and we've said, okay, just let's pretend for a moment that this is actually a different physical line, and then this other line of code, and now the application will execute and run exactly the same as it did before. All right, there we go. Now let me go ahead and get rid of that too. Now I want you to also notice that by default that we get some indentation levels. Like here at this leftmost indentation, we have the module. And then kind of to denote containment, there's another level of indentation for the submain. And then inside of the submain, again, to indicate containment, there is the code that we actually wrote. And then I showed you just a moment ago how I might use indentation another time to indicate some relationship. So if I wanted to do that, that might help me to see that these two lines in 5 and 6 are actually related together, even though they're on two physically separate lines. All right. So there is some indentation by default, and the Visual Studio IDE, the code window that we're typing in, will nudge you in that direction. Even if I tried to, for example, start typing a line of code here and do console.write line, that's all, folks, and I hit enter on the keyboard, all right, it's not going to, because I forced the issue, I made it line up there on the leftmost column, it won't force it, but if I were to just hit the enter key on the keyboard, it's going to put it right there in line with all the other code. All right, so just be aware of that I might need to re-indent some code if I took extraordinary measures in order to move it off to the left-hand side. But indentation is completely optional in Visual Basic. It has no real bearing. Furthermore, white space has no real bearing in my program as well. So you can see I have all this extra white space. It doesn't mean anything. I could actually remove all of it just by kind of making some selections here on my keyboard and deleting. And this will work just as well as this works. So why do you suppose that we have the notion of indentation? Why do you suppose that I add and that the template added white space in between certain containers of code? Well, it makes it a little bit more readable, right? I mean, if you have it all scrunched up together, or you have it way too far apart, or if all of the lines of code are butted up against the left-hand side, it's not visually as easy to tell where you're at in the hierarchy, so to speak, of the code structure. And so that's why Visual Studio automatically will try to nudge you in the right direction to format your code in this way. Now, along the same lines, Visual Studio also color codes certain types of instructions that we type in. So for example, you can see here that this hello world is in this really by default. Your colors might be a little bit different than mine. That it really doesn't matter. The fact is that Visual Studio will try to color some things differently. So by default, you can see here that there's this this dark, deep red color, which indicates that this is a literal string. Then there's this aqua color, which says that this is a class or a module. All right, there are things that have a more a royal blue color. These are keywords inside of Visual Studio, and you'll see some other colors pop up as well. Whenever we use the code comment, notice that the whole line turned green. That says it's a code comment. So different colors, just like indentation levels, just like white space, help the readability of our code. All right, so we've talked about the code that we wrote. Next up, let's talk about the file that we actually wrote our code into, this module1.vb. I don't know if you saw that little tab name up in the upper left-hand corner. And we're going to talk about how code files relate to projects and how projects relate to solutions and what happened whenever we click this Save All button here on our toolbar. And then we'll talk about what actually happened when we ran our program then in the video after that. So there's some important concepts that you're going to learn about project management and about compilation in the next two videos. Make sure you watch them. We'll see you there. Thank you.